Monsters are changing in a big way with the new monster manual coming out next year. A few weeks ago, I previewed what some of these new creatures are going to look like when I took a look at the 13 new monsters that were just released with the Scions of Elemental Evil supplement that kinda came out under the radar. Check out that video already if you haven't to get a good look at what we're going to be facing as of next year because it's looking really intense. Anyway, something that came up quite a few times in the comment section of that video was some people taking issue with the fact that some monsters are getting to quote-unquote break the rules. The one that seemed to stand out the most was the fact that the Knight gets to attack with a heavy crossbow that deals 2d10 piercing damage plus 1d8 radiant damage. So I thought this would be a great time to talk about one of my absolute favorite things to go on and on about, and that is monster design. Let's start off by taking another look at that stat block to make sure that everyone here is on the same page. Before that though, a really quick shout out to all of my members as usual, but especially those in my champion tier, Julian, Corel, and Finiki, as well as the hero tier, Jackal3, and Jumpy Sonic Bear. All of your help and support means so much to me, and it's helping me get one step closer to making this a sustainable thing, so sincerely, thank you all so much. So here is an updated version of the Knight Statblock as found in the Scions of Elemental Evil supplement. Looking at the action section, we can see that the greatsword is mostly normal. It still deals 2d6 damage, but does an added 1d8 radiant damage. But the big offender here is the heavy crossbow, which deals 2d10 piercing damage in the hands of the knight, for reasons, on top of an additional 1d8 radiant damage. The thing is though, that's not even the only area where the knight is cheating. The heavy crossbow very fittingly has the heavy property, which means that ranged attacks made with it are at disadvantage if the user's dexterity isn't at least 13. Lo and behold, the knight's dexterity is 11. So what gives? Why isn't the knight attacking at disadvantage when it's using its heavy crossbow? Well, because. That's honestly the answer. I'm not sure where the notion came from that monsters needed to follow all the same rules that players do, because they just don't. And this isn't even a new phenomenon. They've been cheating forever. So let's travel back in time to the 2014 Monster Manual and look at some other examples here and go a little bit more in depth about some of the principles of monster design. Even just looking alphabetically, one of the first creatures that you come across from the 2014 Monster Manual is the Acolyte. It's such a generic, bog-standard enemy, and yet it's got plenty of cheating going on. Now, this was back in the day when monsters still used spell slots, but you'll notice that it's described in the stat block as being a first-level spellcaster, and yet somehow it has access to 3 first-level spell slots. How? How dare you? It also has 2 hit dice, 2d8 rather than the 1 that you would expect from a first-level spellcaster, assuming of course that it's abiding by character creation rules. And make no mistake, this is not something that is unique to the Acolyte by any stretch of the imagination. The Drow Elite Warrior short sword deals an additional 3d6 poison damage on a hit, and its hand crossbow can potentially impart the poison condition on a failed saving throw. They don't need to apply poisons or anything between rounds, it just always does it. The Duergar Despot gets to deal an extra 2d8 damage to prone creatures, or can just opt to swap any of its 4 attacks for a Flame Jet, which is basically just a supercharged Scorching Ray. And then there's the Merilith, which gets as many reactions as there are creatures in combat. But I can hear you. None of these are the same as a creature just getting to deal extra damage with a regular old run-of-the-mill weapon. A heavy crossbow is a heavy crossbow is a heavy crossbow. Well, what if I told you that it wasn't, and that probably most damningly, this exact cheat that was being called out here has also existed since the 2014 Monster Manual. The Bugbear Chief is a medium humanoid that gets to attack with a Morningstar that deals 2d8 damage instead of 1d8, and additionally, it also has a Javelin that deals 2d6 damage instead of 1d6 when used in melee. Now, I specifically mentioned the fact that the Bugbear Chief is a medium creature because the Monster Manual does also contain some guidance about how to scale up monster damage. We can see here that it specifically recommends scaling up a weapon by 1 damage die for each size that a creature is above medium. This is why a hill giant wielding a great club deals 3d8 damage rather than 1d8. The Bugbear Chief is not a giant. It does, however, have a trait called Brute, which does say that any damage dealt by one of its melee weapons gets to add 1 additional damage die to it though. And this phenomenon is not even unique to the Bugbear Chief either. The Gladiator, also from the 2014 Monster Manual, has a spear that deals 2d6 or 2d8 damage depending on how many hands it is being wielded with, rather than the typical 1d6 or 1d8, and yes, it also has the Brute trait. Remember that though, we're going to come back to it a little bit later. What we're seeing here isn't some desperate attempt by Wizards of the Coast to find ways to keep up with player strength. What it is just them wielding the tools they have at their disposal to ensure that the game is simultaneously fun and challenging, and they're doing this through design asymmetry. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm truly not sure where the idea came from that monsters needed to be able to abide by all the same rules as players. This has never been the case and will almost certainly never be the case, and there's plenty of good reasons for it too. Before we get to why, I will say that I can understand why this might sound odd. Characters and monsters are all part of the same world, so it seems logical that they should all abide by the same rules. Now, this would be true if their purpose was the same, but it's not. Let's explain. The role of a monster and the role of a player are fundamentally not the same thing. The only reason that anything you can do as a player has any relevance or power is because there's a challenge ascribed to that thing. Think of any class feature or spell or weapon or anything in the game. Let's say Fireball. This is generally considered to be a good spell, but what if every enemy in the game was immune to fire damage? Then it becomes largely useless. What if you had an item that gave you immunity to poison damage, but there were no effects or enemies in the game that dealt poison damage? Then again, it becomes a useless thing. The role of a monster is to function as an obstacle or puzzle or a narrative tool. Their abilities don't need to adhere to any of the same principles of balance as player characters do because they serve to provoke creative problem solving rather than just to win the fight. Now, to be clear, this is not to suggest that monsters don't need to abide by any semblance of balance. They absolutely do. It's just that that balance isn't designed to match that of the character, but rather to contend with it. Monsters have purpose-driven design, whereas player characters and abilities are more intended for long-term progression and development, so they often are geared towards fairness in a cooperative setting. Monsters just don't have that restriction. Instead, they're often designed for single or short-term encounters. Their abilities should be focused around creating engaging and challenging experiences that cause a character to think about how to utilize their various abilities. Honestly, I think I would go so far as to say that symmetry between character and monster design would be a bad thing, at least in D&D. If you're a relatively new DM, this might not be that hard, but think back to the first time that you dropped a legendary action or legendary resistance on your party during play and what their reactions were like. I remember it so viscerally. The looks of concern, the oh shit, the everything. It was palpable. Moments like that exist because of design asymmetry and because creatures are not created to the same standard that player characters are. It's what allows DMs to surprise players and create encounters that feel both unique and dangerous, without requiring them to be beholden to the same types of resources that players are. Symmetry creates predictability, and while that might be appealing to some, it certainly allows for less excitement. The way that monsters are designed allows encounters to transcend simple combat and instead be used also as a storytelling tool. One of my favorite examples of this in action are things like the Banshee's Wail or a Dragon's Breath attack. These things convey story through fear and the unexpected as much as they are also a vehicle for damage. I similarly remember the first time that I described that blood-curdling, spine-chilling shriek emanating from the ghostly figure in the corner of the room, then calling for a saving throw and letting two of my players know that their characters are now at 0 hit points and unconscious. The panic sets in, the tension mounts, the groups start to figure out the best way to handle the situation. There's no player equivalent to this kind of ability, and especially not as early in the game as you would typically encounter a Banshee. And that's what makes it so memorable, because it doesn't just follow the same old rules as everyone else. All that being said though, 5e has struck something of a balance between the two extremes here of symmetry and asymmetry. When you look at a monster stat block, most things seem familiar. They have armor class and hit points and the same 6 ability scores. They have actions and reactions and resistances and immunities. It's all there. They just manifest themselves differently and can often be expressed differently as well. What this does is allow for both the DM and the player to have a shared understanding of the fundamentals. It prevents things from getting completely out of hand, since there is still that general framework that things need to fall into, but it allows the freedom to break out of that mold, at least to some degree. There's another point that came up as well that's also worth it to address. So if we take a step back again and look at the knight's heavy crossbow dealing extra damage, if the knight is killed in combat and a player picks it up, Do they get to deal 2d10 damage with that crossbow? The obvious answer here is no. The player doesn't have the brute trait, so why would we start using it now? This does then raise the question of where the brute trait went, but again, we're going to talk about that in a second. Moreover, it's also possible that the player wouldn't even know what damage is being rolled. Granted though, some tables do roll everything in the open. But in either case, you just kind of told the damage and you move on. But then there's even more significant examples of this, where a creature potentially drops a magic weapon that doesn't nearly resemble what they were using in combat. From the recent book, Quest from the Infinite Staircase, Drelnza wields a legendary longsword called Heretic. Longswords typically deal 1d8 damage, but they are versatile so they can deal 1d10 if wielded with two hands. Well, when wielded by Drelnza, there isn't even a choice. It just always uses a d10 for its damage dice, but it deals 6d10 damage in her hands. That is a whole lot more than a typical longsword. And to be clear, if a player picks up the item once they kill her, it does not deal 6d10 damage. It is a legendary item, so it does get a +3 to attack and damage rolls, but it just goes back to being a 1d8 versatile longsword for 1d10. Shout out to the Crimson Witch in my Discord for bringing up this example, and check out my Discord server if you haven't already. Links in the description. The whole point here is to emphasize that this quote-unquote cheating is far from a new phenomenon, and is really just part of the process of making enemies engaging and challenging. I also don't know of any player that's going to be upset if they picked up Heretic and it isn't dealing 6d10 damage. Players understand the difference implicitly, even if there is no rule to reference. They definitely don't want to just completely trivialize every combat encounter from that point forward. One final thing I wanted to address is the idea of reverse engineering. The idea that you should be able to look at the information on a stat block and figure out, based on what was written, how all of it came to be. The thing is though that I don't think that needs to be the case, or at least it doesn't need to be in the stat block itself. This is just another one of those fundamental differences between player characters and monsters. If you look at your Dragonborn character, for example, they have a species feature called damage resistance, which explains that you have resistance to a damage type as determined by your draconic ancestry trait. No dragon stat block spells that out, they just have resistance to the associated damage type. Fire elementals are immune to fire and poison damage. Why? Because they are, and because it makes sense. You're not going to find any associated features explaining why any of these things are there, because it is, to at least some degree, expected that monsters will just innately have certain things without the need for explanation, because they have that purpose-driven design that we discussed earlier. They exist to challenge the player's capabilities. If the designers opted to list everything, the blocks would become incredibly bloated and needlessly detailed, and providing next to zero benefit anyway. What we see instead in the trait section are things that often require action on the DM's part to activate, or things that make these creatures stand out in particular. This can include a Hobgoblin Warlord's Martial Advantage trait, or the Fire Elemental's Fire Form. This is exactly why I think the Brute trait has been removed. It was just a passive one. It required no activation or no intent on the DM's side. The trait even specifically said that the damage has already been added to the attack description. So I believe that in an effort to reduce unnecessary wording in the stat blocks, the design team has likely removed any traits that were simple passive effects because it was equally understandable by just reading the block. We can also see here in the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide a list of sample traits that creatures might have. Now again, this is not an exhaustive list, it is described as being a list of sample traits, but we do see that Brute is not here, so that might say something? Some further confirmation of this as well comes from another one of those subtle supplemental adventures that just kind of got released. Uni and the Hunt for the Lost Horn included an updated Bugbear Warrior stat block, which is effectively a replacement for the old Bugbear. Now here we can see that the stat block is significantly different from the old one. Notably as well, it does not include the Brute trait. However, we do notice that the light hammer action that it has deals 3d4 damage rather than the typical 1d4 that a light hammer would do. So again, I think it's pretty clear that they've just removed the passive effects from the trait section. To be clear, I'm not saying that monster creation should be a total clown fiesta either. There should be some standards to follow that detail what adding or removing something can do to a creature's challenge rating. As of right now, in 2024 at least, we don't really have this. In 2014, there was a far more detailed section in the Dungeon Master's Guide about creating custom monsters, but that's absent in the new book, and instead it offers some suggestions for making some very light modifications to existing creatures. I'm hopeful that we will get some more details on this though in the new monster manual, but we're gonna have to wait and see on that. So to go back to the original point, The new monsters aren't cheating. They're just doing what they've always done to ensure that they are providing an adequate challenge to the party in a given campaign. The Knight dealing 2d10 damage with its crossbow or adding 1d8 radiant damage isn't a problem. It's intended design and can also signal to dungeon masters how they can adjust things on the fly. Maybe you're concerned about adding some bonus elemental damage to a creature in fear of it making the enemy too strong, but this is letting you know that it might be completely fine, or that if you wanted to reflavor the Knight to be undead or something, you could just as easily change that damage to necrotic or poison damage. That's also something else that we're seeing a lot of with these new creatures so far. There's way more signals to a DM about how they can change something without having to be worried about skewing the balance of an encounter, and that's really great to see. So let me know what you think about the new Knight and the updated monster design in general in the comments. Check out some of my other D&D videos, but otherwise, take care.